Everyone. Welcome to this thrilling webinar from me, Joshua Culp. We'll be talking about resources and information that you can use when you have an Asterisk problem and you're seeking help. Before we get started though, my name is Joshua Culp, the Asterisk guy at Sangoma, also known as the Hat Guy in other places. So I'm a director of engineering at Sangoma. I'm also the project lead for Asterisk, which is basically the guy who puts together the roadmap and all the planning at Sangoma for Asterisk and what we work on over time. And then I also push other open source endeavors at Sangoma as well. So kind of the open source guy as well. Before we get started, for those who may not be aware or need a reminder, AstriCon is quickly approaching. This year, we're heading to the West Coast as part of Scale, which is an open source conference. We'll be in Pasadena, California, March 5th and 6th. And like always, we'll have some great content, some great presentations. I'll be presenting about performance in Asterisk, which is always a hot topic. So that'll be good. And now let's move on to looking for help when it comes to Asterisk. So what we're going to cover in this webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit about a history of documentation when it comes to Asterisk, the methods we have for interactive help or real time, our documentation site, where that documentation lives, as well as how you can actually contribute back to the project and help with documentation. Finally, some tips for getting help, because I've been around quite a few years, so I can give nice, easy tips on stuff to provide when you have specific situations. And we'll also be having a Q&A. So as I'm going through this, if you think of any questions, feel free to use the GoToWebinar questions method to submit those, and then at the end, we'll review those. As well on this webinar, we also have Mike White and Chris from the salesy kind of side of things. So if you do have salesy questions, submit those and maybe they can answer, or I could try to answer and make something completely up. Who knows? We'll see. So throughout this, you'll find kind of meme stuff put in by marketing. So this is from Office Space. If you haven't seen Office Space, highly recommend. So documentation, what's that? Asterisk is a mature old project. So Asterisk was released in 1999, and with lots of open source projects and also products in general, honestly. In the beginning, it's not about documentation. It's about making cool things, writing cool code. And so in the beginning, Asterisk had no real good documentation. Asterisk might tell you what things were for. Error messages might tell you about missing options. As well, some things were also loosely documented in configuration files. But even to this day, configuration files may not reflect all available options. Some things just get lost over time. So in the beginning, it was really up to everyone to figure out what to do with Asterisk, how to use it, to share information. So you'd also read about things in various places as well. So it was really the Wild West back then. As Asterisk as a project matured, documentation came into scope. So in the beginning, we added the ability for a description to be placed on dial plan applications like Dial to give better documentation insight into how to use it, the available options. This better documented things and showed you what they did. However, this was done directly in the Asterisk C source code, which meant the only place to view it was in a running Asterisk, using something like core show application dial, which still works to this day. As well as additional things got added like dial plan functions. CLI command was also added to allow you to see the information about that as well. Configuration files also expanded with more information and more detail. Though like I said previously, some things still didn't get added because they just got missed in the C code and never appeared in the configuration files. However, this really only talked about really only showed the configuration that was available for modules and didn't really show you how to put different pieces together. So for example, it wouldn't show you how to configure a full phone system. It would just show you, here's how you use dial. So it was only a stepping stone to better documentation overall. Uh, Asterisk continued to mature, and we stepped into the Atlassian suite of products. So Jira, Confluence, Crowd, and a few others. So when this was implemented, um, we started documenting things in our Confluence wiki. And this was more specific detail about putting those pieces together or planning information, development details, that kind of stuff. Um, so, uh, so you would see, like I said, how to make a phone system, for example. However, there was still the case where you had something like dial that was actually showing you information about how to use it, but you had to open a running asterisk and run the command to see it. So a project was undertaken to try to make that information available in such a way that we could also show it on the wiki. So we decided to put that documentation into XML in the Asterisk source code so it could be used by Asterisk itself, but we could also write scripts and things to take that information out and put it on the wiki. So that's what happened when it came to Confluence. And this actually continues to this day. So the XML documentation still in Asterisk source code and it still gets pulled out. A nice thing about this is that a lot of documentation actually gets reviewed as part of the complete request to add it into Asterisk. So as part of actually reviewing code, we also review documentation. If someone adds a new option but forgets to document it, then we can make that immediately evident and request that it be added. It also means we can actually programmatically enforce that. So for developers, XML actually has to exist for certain things to load. A good example of this would be PJSIP. If someone adds a new PJSIP option but forgets to document it, then that option will not be available and will not work. So it forces the developer to actually document it. So going forward, we try to ensure that documentation doesn't get missed. However, there are some cases where that XML doesn't exist, and it really comes down to old functionality or modules. So in those cases, that documentation still generally only exists in their sample configuration file. This is a good area which would make a good first contribution to Asterisk. So moving or creating that XML so that we can more flush out our XML documentation. For larger modules, something we've recently started doing is actually having separate XML files in the Asterisk source code tree. So some examples of that would be PJSIP, geolocation, and a bit of ARI. And that's because previously, and still for a lot of stuff, that XML appears at the top of a C file. And for really large stuff, it ends up taking up a large portion of the C file. So we just decided to use a separate XML file instead and pull that out. It cleans up the code nicely and is also easier to review, and it makes text editors a little bit more happy. So we do provide some methods for seeking interactive help. In the early days, like many things, we started with email mailing lists and also Internet Relay Chat or IRC. As with many open source projects in the early days, it's go, go, go. So substantial communication happened across both of those as things were still being decided, code was flooding in, all of that. Sometime later, a forum was added, which really saw use by users and not so much developers. So that became a place that a lot of people migrated to from a user perspective. And we've actually carried this over a lot these days still. So we remain on IRC in the Asterisk and Asterisk Dev channels. We have the Asterisk Dev mailing list on groups.io. We don't have a user mailing list, primarily because the user base mailing lists just aren't something that most people from a user base use these days. So after looking at options, we decided not to carry that over. The place that people really migrated to was the forum. So our forums are extremely active at community.asterisk.org. If you post something up there, depending on what you're asking about, you will most likely get a response, usually by me, because I'm always looking over there. But these are the best methods for interactive help from a project perspective. So Junior, where is documentation? I am documentation. This is actually a good point. I've been around as part of the Asterisk project for a substantial amount of time. So I know a lot of stuff, and I'm always working on writing that down and sharing it out so that we can ensure knowledge isn't lost. Now, all questionable things, such as the Atlassian stack, come to an end. So 2 years ago, we actually moved away from Atlassian as a whole over to GitHub. This included documentation. We did not opt for using GitHub Wiki. We decided to build a documentation site instead. And some of the goals around this was making it easier to edit, contribute, and generate. In the Atlassian days, someone would have to have a user account with special permissions, and we wouldn't be able to review changes either. So there were some cases where a contributor who had access made changes, they weren't correct, and we actually ended up having to revert them. So that's something we wanted to ensure we didn't run into again. So we came up with a different process, which I'll talk about here in the next slide. But this documentation site is actually at docs.asterisk.org. So this is our primary documentation site. Great resource. If you have issues, look there first and poke around. This move, however, was not simple. We didn't want to lose our Atlassian wiki documentation. So we wrote a custom conversion process to extract all of this content and move it into simple markdown files, which are just text files. I will note this process was not perfect by any means, and there continues to be remnants of issues, but overall it worked surprisingly well. And we didn't really lose any information that we previously had, which is good. So like I said, these markdown files are simple text files, which can have some formatting information added to them. And these also live in GitHub as their own repo, so in the documentation repository. We accept pull requests, meaning anyone can contribute documentation changes. And these act as a good first kind of stepping stone into Asterisk itself. So if you want to contribute back to the project, great place to start. These are updated daily at docs.asterisk.org. These also do include the previously mentioned XML documentation, as well as ARI documentation. So we have a script, which is also in the repo, which pulls these out of the Asterisk source code and turns them into documentation. This is then used to construct markdown files themselves. However, we don't commit these into the repository. So if you go to the documentation repository, you're not going to see them. They're done separately. And that's primarily to make it so that each night we're not committing huge swaths of generated files. We just create them and upload them as part of the process that builds the site. So each night, script runs to produce documentation and uploads it to the docs.asterisk.org site. So we support current supported versions of Asterisk when it comes to taking that XML documentation. So that would be 20, 22, 23, and master right now. And the nice thing about all of this is that this can actually be done on your own system. So if you're making documentation changes, you can go ahead and host essentially a little private web server of the docs site on your own computer. Which makes it even nicer for contributing back to the Asterisk documentation. The process to do this isn't too complicated. So fork the documentation repository, make a branch for your changes, make any changes you want, test them. Like I said, you can serve it up locally, and it looks exactly the same as if you had visited the website. You commit it, submit a pull request, and then follow through on any change requests. Generally, we're very forgiving when it comes to the documentation repo. So as long as it's reasonable, it usually goes in quite quickly. So there are cases, specifically the XML documentation that I mentioned, where you can't do this in the documentation repository. Instead, you have to go to Asterisk itself and go through that contribution process, which is a little bit more complicated, but still possible for people. Yep. So I am putting a request out there if you are interested in documentation and contributing back to the project. There's some areas where some contributions would be helpful. So we have both a samples and basic PBX directory in Asterisk under configs. Samples are sample configuration files that cover as much stuff as reasonable. And then basic PBX is actually what it says, a basic PBX configuration set of files. So alongside of these, it would be ideal if we had additional examples of usage of parts of Asterisk. So for example, a call center or a voicemail system or some ARI usage, that kind of stuff would be nice to see. Something else is that if you as a user of Asterisk are using any outside libraries or projects, documenting those on the documentation site is also greatly appreciated. There's some for AGI, AMI, and ARI. So if you come across any, submitting a pull request to add them or update them would be greatly appreciated. So from a potential future improvements perspective when it comes to documentation, like I said before, we'd like to move older modules over to the new XML format so we can have a complete documented list on the website, on the doc site for everything. And then something else is also generating sample configuration files from that XML. So all the sample configuration files right now are handwritten by people when they contribute things, when they create a new module, that kind of stuff. It would be nice if instead that was automatically generated from the sample configuration file instead. Or rather, if we generate sample configuration files from the XML instead, to ensure that those sample configuration files have an accurate, complete view of all the different options and such. Now let's get to the part that everyone's probably interested in, which is actually getting help. So this is Josh's recommendations / guide / thoughts on seeking help. So my first tip is always check docs.asterisk.org. So if you're wanting to do something when it comes to a dial plan application or function, choose the version you're using and then go to dial plan applications or functions. Same goes for ARI, and actually look at the documentation there. So what I see a lot is people on the forum, they provide their configuration. So for example, they're using dial and they're like, hey, how can I announce to the called party that this call is recorded or it's regarding something? So in that case, there's an option for dial to do that, and that is documentation or documented on the site. So my recommendation is always check that documentation first to see if there's any options or functionality that will actually help you achieve what you're trying to do. As well, the forum site has been around in various versions for a long time, so it has a ton of posts and information about things. So another good step is to search community.asterisk.org and see if there's been an existing post talking about what you're having issues with. I see a lot of people who don't do this, and I know this because they end up posting the same question that's been asked like 2 days before. So actually checking and searching and stuff can save you some time. And then posting on community.asterisk.org is a great idea as well. However, do realize that everyone there, they're not under any obligation or SLA to respond to you. There is no time frame or guarantee. So your urgency does not get transferred onto them. So just keep that in mind. If you're more interested in real-time chats, trying to get help that way, IRC at irc.libera.chat in the Asterisk channel. So you can ask a question there. There's always people hanging out talking about stuff. We also have a jobs category on the forum if you're willing to pay. So my recommendation for that is go into as much depth as you can on what you're actually trying to achieve or your issue, and provide either contact information or state that leave your contact information and I'll reach out. So give them details on how to contact you. An additional reminder, standard stuff, Sangoma plays no involvement in that, so we can't do anything if something goes awry. As well, we also have L5 support agreements, which are essentially the highest tier support agreements you can get from Sangoma when it comes to Asterisk. These agreements give you direct access to the Asterisk team for issues and questions. They also come with SLAs. They are not for everyone, and we do have a vetting process to make sure that they're a good fit for you. If this is something that you're interested in, feel free to leave a question on here. We have Mike White on from Open Source Sales, who can generally answer questions about that if I can't, and also would be a good point of contact. As always, remember, the more information you can provide, the better. Personally, the less back and forth I have to do, it makes me less frustrated and more likely to jump in and help you. As well, withholding information or trying to obscure information is also not a great idea. It can be extremely easy to see this, and the act of doing that can also harm getting help because you may have just like obscured the actual problem or the reason for it. So try to avoid that if possible as well. So next up, I'm going to go into specific situations or problem categories, and I'll talk about things that I would need to see as someone who would be providing help to actually hopefully solve a problem. So first up is SIP issues. This first line, provide a description of the problem, seems like an obvious thing, but a lot of people don't. They just say it's not working, and not working is not enough detail to actually allow a person to investigate what's going on. So some examples of a good description of the problem is I am calling out my ITSP. So there's a detail ITSP, not a local gateway, and the remote side, and I'm not getting ringing. So that's a good enough level of detail that allows someone who's helping you to actually narrow it down. For example, in that case, I would need to see configuration like I mentioned in the second line, but also SIP trace, because ringing when it comes to SIP can come over a 180 ringing or a 183 session progress. If it's a 180 ringing, then that means Asterisk is either generating that locally or is passing it through. So a SIP trace would also show what's happening. If it's a 183, that means the remote side is providing it as audio, which means they may not be generating it. So we need to see an RTP capture. So even just a brief description of the problem can narrow it down immensely and provide better guidance on what to actually collect and look at. So PJSIP set logger on for getting a SIP trace, or you can use a packet capture on the local system. The PJSIP logger, I don't know how many people know this, but it does have options for filtering on SIP method and host, and it could also write PCAP files directly. This can be useful for isolating busy systems, or rather isolating a busy systems, but it also is good if you are using TLS encrypting your SIP traffic. PGSIP logger will write it out in plain, so it can be a good way for that. External network traces for packet routing or packet parsing issues is also good. Another common SIP issue is, hey, I'm getting an incoming call, but nothing's happening. And in that case, a SIP capture on the Asterisk side may show that there's nothing. And then if you do a packet capture on the system itself, you may see SIP traffic. And this is something that catches a lot of people off, is that when you're doing a packet capture, that is happening before the local firewall is actually applied, which if you see it in a packet capture but not Asterisk, usually that's the reason it's been firewalled. Something else that a lot of people neglect to actually think about or know is knowing your network topology. SIP as a protocol is just a mess when it comes to embedding IP addresses and routing within the SIP traffic itself. And so knowing the network topology is also critical. A good example of this is when it comes to I'm getting an incoming call and it disconnects after 32 seconds. I've seen this a few times. That's a common issue. You're not getting an ACK from the remote side. However, knowing the network topology can also further narrow it down as to why, because if you're in an AWS environment, then you have to configure Asterisk to know it's behind a net. And some people forget to do that. So that's a good thing to know as well. Crashes and deadlocks. So as Asterisk has matured over time, crashes and deadlocks have decreased but still do exist. So this is the things that really, really I like to see and others like to see when it comes to this situation. So a detailed description of the environment, OS configuration loaded modules is good because it gives us insight into what you've actually loaded and what you're doing with Asterisk to be able to further narrow it down. Alongside that, console output prior to the issue can be really enlightening as well in that regard. But the best thing to actually provide when it comes to crashes and deadlocks is a backtrace. We have a shell script that we've put together called ast core dumper that we ship with Asterisk, which tries to do its best to get usable backtrace information. So we'll go and look for core dumps and extract those out. You can put them into tarballs so you can send them off. And it also has an option for getting a backtrace if Asterisk is deadlocked in some manner. And then this last point is, don't forget to include any custom patches or modules. Some people try to hide this and we can still see. And I wouldn't say quite a few, but in some cases, we have seen that these issues are the result of those custom patches or third-party changes. In those cases, as a project, we can't really help. That has to go to wherever those patches came from. But it does allow us to at least not waste our time when it comes to trying to investigate. So don't try to hide it. We can still see. Another common thing is dial plan logic issues. And like I said before, provide a description of what you're trying to achieve. When it comes to dial plan, this is something that people also don't seem to do that often, is just say what they're trying to do. Instead, it becomes, here's a dial plan, this isn't working. And then sometimes we can piece together what people are trying to achieve. Sometimes we can't. So providing a description is a great idea. Also provide the console output of showing what's actually happening when the dial plan is executing. And then something which seems obvious, but also some people don't do, provide the dial plan that's having the issue. And then provide filtered logs from before and after the issue, because prior dial plan application usage or just dial plan usage in general may be the cause of it. And if you're just showing the little bit of dial plan execution, that may not show the whole story. So if you haven't, the only thing you take from my webinar is provide a description of what you're trying to achieve. That's good enough for me, because more people need to do that. If you're wanting to actually provide help, one of the ways is contributing documentation changes and improvements, like I mentioned before. You can participate on the Asterisk community forums at community.asterisk.org. If you think you have any input on any particular post or problem that people are happening, or a problem that people are having, feel free to respond. It's okay. You might not be certain, but just disclose that. You can also lurk on the IRC channel and participate. You can also review issues and help test things in our GitHub repos. Yeah, so anything you can do to help the project is always welcome. I will add, I have not written it on here, but I will go down a slight spiel about AI. Just a disclaimer, if you are using AI to facilitate any of your interaction, be it on the forum, pull requests, documentation, etc., please disclose it. And if you try to hide it, yet again, we will know. I know. I can tell. It is very obvious in many cases. And also, if you are using AI rather, review what it's producing, because as hopefully we all know, it can hallucinate and make things up. And that actually happened on a pull request here recently, where the commit message said one thing and Asterisk can't do what it was saying. So that's not great. And on that note, does anyone have any questions? Let me check. No questions. I'll hang out here for a few minutes if you did think of any questions. And questions can be about help, Asterisk, salesy stuff. Doesn't really matter. Hey, Mike and Chris, do you want to join me on the virtual speaking this?
I'd love to.
Hey.
Sounds great.
Yes, everyone, this is Mike White and Chris May. Mike White,
Hi, everyone.
Being, what are you these days, Mike?
My acting title is Vice President of Open Source.
Hey.
Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us today. Certainly appreciate it. I think Josh is, notorious for putting together great comments and content, but can never forget his cold hard facts as well. So keep an eye out for those.
Maybe we should have a cold hard fact for this. I'll do a cold hard fact, hashtag cold hard facts. The more back and forth I have to do on a forum post or an issue, the less inclined I am to respond in a prompt manner. So you may get a response tomorrow instead. We have a statement or a question. Console verbosity, how many V's? That's a complicated question. So I'll go on a tangent since no one else is asking questions. Logging in Asterisk is a complicated thing that has evolved over time. And to a certain degree, when things should appear in logs, it can sometimes be a personal preference. So we're still working on adjusting that. I think the highest that verbosity within the code will go is maybe 6 to 8. And if you're at that point, it gets really loud. Debug is even worse. Yeah, 7. Yeah. I will say one of the other things from a development perspective that I am pushing extremely hard also is to, going forward, that our log messages are much more user-friendly as much as they can be and provide actual useful information. So a good example is in the past, if something happened to do with a channel, usually the channel name wouldn't be in the log message. It would just see, hey, this happened. So going forward, I'm pushing as much detail and specificity as we can in log messages. That's a personal goal kind of thing too. Any other questions? Oh, I'll also throw out logging could probably be a separate presentation in and of itself. If you're having issues, remember to check your Asterisk logs at startup because many things will tell you about issues that may have occurred when loading modules. Good example being PJSIP. If you are expecting a PJSIP endpoint to exist and it doesn't exist, most likely you've used an option that doesn't exist or has an invalid value, which would have shown up in your logs at startup. So always check those too. Any other questions? Going once, going twice, going 3 times. If you do think of any questions, we'll push the forum. Feel free to ask them on the forum if you're having issues or anything. I'll probably chime in. Otherwise, I call this webinar to an end. And as Mike said, thank you everyone for attending. This has been recorded. It will be, ooh, Alexa just went crazy. It'll be up online. This is material that I'll probably be linking in various places. So if you have coworkers or other individuals who could not make it, but you think this would be relevant for, then stay tuned for a link to it. And thanks very much, everyone, for coming.